Perspective might be thought of as an extremely dry and uninteresting subject to deal with in a basic drawing class. But it shouldn't be, and I'm going to do my best to make it interesting and make you keen to observe it in real life and notice how it is deployed as a creative tool in art, advertising, and especially filmmaking. As well, of course, you'll be able to mess around with it in your own drawings and paintings. Understanding and being able to apply perspective is essential to learning how to draw well. It is also an extremely powerful creative tool that, if often overlooked by painters, is not overlooked by comic book artists, advertisers, and filmmakers. We're going to study some basic attributes of perspective in this series of movies, and later I'll give you some live action demos for you to look at, after which you must put in the time, the many hours, to practice using perspective in your own drawings. Ultimately, with a technical understanding of how to correctly apply perspective, as well as knowing how to measure angles and proportions, you will develop an eye for good perspective in a drawing, and you'll be able to generally just wing your observational drawings and get perspective more or less correct. And sometimes, in studio creations, you will be able to alter observational drawings or photo reference to make them conform with one type of perspective projection or another, or some point of view or another that will make the image more compelling or dramatic. We don't exactly see like any of these projections, although we often perceive our view of the world similarly to some more than others at various times and various places. Each type of perspective we will look at, parallel, single point, 2-point, 3-point, is actually a projection of sorts. An analogy might be in how a map of the world is actually a projection that flattens the world out from its wraparound appearance on a globe. This is why flat maps of the world are known as projections, such as the Mercator projection. There are various projections of the globe in maps. In order to flatten the globe out, distortions have to be made somewhere. Look at the size of Greenland, the white continental body here on the globe, in proportion to Africa. Now look at the size of Greenland compared to Africa on this map projection. If you can see why such distortions have political implications, then you might also see why perspective projections can emphasize and communicate compelling points of view in visual art. Bear in mind the compressibility of the notions about perspective taking place in these summaries. Bear in mind also that I'm not an engineer or draftsperson by trade, but rather a wishy-washy artist who is trained to draw and make pictures. What I know of perspective comes solely from the practical applications applied to observational drawing and drawing for fine and commercial visual arts. An extensive understanding of technical drawing is not necessarily necessary for the visual artist. However, a casual understanding would be, and it is my casual understanding that I'm trying to confer in the following, in the hope that you too will find it as useful as I do. Here's a parallel projection of a box. What is interesting here is to notice how, if you pick up and inspect a box, you might not consider linear perspective whatsoever. Just that in actuality, a square box in your hands has parallel edges or lines on adjacent corners, and that they should not in fact ever converge. But set the box on a table, step back and look at that same box, and you will clearly see this appears to be the case because of the effects of foreshortening or linear perspective. The box edges on the same side of the box, if extended, appear to vector off and converge at the horizon. Unlike the parallel projection, linear perspective makes the parallel edges look as though they are vectoring off straight into infinity to converge in the distance on the horizon, either to the left or the right, or possibly a horizon above or below. In a parallel projection, there is no converging on the horizon. There is no horizon. Those parallel lines go off into infinity, never ever meeting, or appearing to meet. If we actually viewed the world in a parallel projection, the other side of the room would be the same size as this side, that is, size as. The hills or mountains off in the distance would be size as also. So would the moon and the sun and the galaxy and the Milky Way and the whole universe. It would all crowd into our field of vision, at least until one thing crowded out another. You don't often see parallel projections in art, but you'll often see a particular type of parallel projection used by engineers, product designers, or architects to describe discrete widgets or structures. This is the isometric projection, in which the point of view geometry is such that when viewed from above, near side horizontal lines that are on the ground plane are at a 30-degree angle from the bottom of the picture frame. Isometric perspective is very useful because you can compare the size of one part or one side of the box to another coherently. If this square box, for example, were 1 meter high and 1 meter wide and 1 meter deep, we could readily observe or measure that the other side was 1 meter also, with no distortion of relative proportion due to the effects of linear perspective. For this reason, an isometric drawing can contain an enormous amount of information for the trained engineering eye to behold. Here is a two-point perspective. There are 2 points on the horizon to which parallel lines on the box can be seen to converge. These are called the vanishing points. Notice how the vertical lines appear plumb, straight up and down. When we are observationally drawing a box and step back far enough, this is how the box appears when we measure the angles of the plumb lines, even though we know that the vertical lines also must be angled and converging both above and below the box as well to vanishing points. If you are in a room, try looking around at the objects in it, the door jambs, the windows, the corners, and measure them. Measure the angles of them as you have been shown with your pencil. Measure the angle of all the vertical lines. They should appear plumb if you are set back from them. But they can't be. The vertical lines should be, from a point of view of a camera, should be converging up into the sky somewhere and converging deep into the earth somewhere. And at the corner of our vision, they must at some point between the upper vanishing point and the lower vanishing point distort and curve around to reconverge with opposite vanishing points. They appear plumb because our eyes and head constantly move to look directly at them. As well, we have very little peripheral vision, only a small locus of it in the center of our field of vision. Within that narrowly defined area, verticals appear plumb. We do not perceive the world quite like a camera, which has a single fixed point of view. Here is a 3-point perspective. Look closely and you notice not only do the horizontal lines on the box vector off to converge on the horizon, but now the vertical lines converge down to a vanishing point on a horizon on, well, the other side of the world, I suppose. You can also get your vantage point below the box, looking up at it, and see the vertical lines vector off to a vanishing point off in space. And here is a single point perspective. Notice how on only one side of the box the edges converge on the horizon. On the other side, the edges remain completely parallel as they vector off into infinity. Single point perspective is the classic middle of the railway tracks view heading off to the horizon, with the tracks converging at the horizon on a single vanishing point. It's also the classic looking down an elevator shaft view. We can shuffle to one side or the other, like so. Notice how the perspective in early Renaissance painting was often single point. Sometimes I wonder if it is because they might have had 2-point perspective only half figured out. Look closely and see how only on one aspect of the building the lines converge on the horizon in this painting. On the other side, the side facing us, the lines remain parallel. And here, and here, and here. Perspective in general must have taken the breath away of spectators beholding a painting, employing it shortly after its discovery. In murals in churches and public buildings, it represented an astonishing new way of seeing visual art, comparable perhaps to the invention of the moving picture or digital special effects in terms of convincibility. On YouTube, you can find the very film, of the train pulling into the station made by the Lumiere brothers, which, when first projected to an audience, is alleged to have made people fall or leap off their chairs. Think of dramatic special effects sequences in the cinema today, and how an audience winces and flinches at the possibility of shrapnel or large objects emerging from the screen and striking them. I think the advent of perspective must have caused audiences to fall off their chairs or pews in a similar fashion. But single point perspective is especially dramatic, seeming to plunge the viewer's eye towards infinity in an image. Single point perspective can be deliberately chosen to be used for dramatic upshots on Baroque ceilings, or dramatic scenes in classical paintings or contemporary comic books or modern filmmaking. To finish this little movie, let me show you a few pictures of wonderful applications of something very close to a single point perspective from just one filmmaker who seems to have made this point of view a hallmark of his visual style. That's Stanley Kubrick, the director of 2001: A Space Odyssey. I saw this film at about 8 years old in the theatre in Canterbury and was imprinted by this film, and I've watched it dozens of times, and the rest of Kubrick's films dozens more. And as I watched more and more of Kubrick's films over the years, I noticed, even at a young age, before I had any concept of what I was seeing, that while most scenes in the body of the film had the usual asymmetrical, slightly chaotic sense of asymmetrical balance, some scenes, special ones, scenes to remember, had a kind of fearful symmetry about them. Later in life, and even more viewings of his films, it became apparent that there was indeed a kind of symmetry employed as emphasis in very special scenes that was having a deep psychological effect on me and presumably other viewers. This fearful symmetry was the result of creating a scene with a looking down an elevator shaft kind of single point perspective point of view. In the next little movie, I'll discuss some of the interesting ways in which perspective can be used creatively in drawings and painting and film. I like using film and some other forms of mass media for examples of basic drawing concepts, because most of us watch film, and when it has high production values and is executed with great skill and craft, it is beautiful to behold. This can be the case even on a fairly pop film, a blockbuster, or in advertising, adverts on television, or in title sequences.